Hello and welcome to the F1 Strategy Report for 2018. My name's Michael Lamonato and this is Round 9, the Austrian Grand Prix. The Austrian Grand Prix was predicted to be a straightforward one-stop win for Mercedes, but when the Styrian summer sun made an appearance, everything changed. Red Bull Racing won its home Grand Prix for the first time at the hands of Max Verstappen, but with 3 of the 6 frontrunners retiring, it was anything but easy. To look back at an unexpectedly enthralling Austrian Grand Prix, I'm joined by freelance F1 journalist Abhishek Takle. Abhishek, how you doing?
Hi Michael, great to be back. Thank you for having me.
Oh, not at all, any time, especially when we've got actually something to talk about, which is a terrific change from a lot of the doomsaying before the Grand Prix, which we all expected this to be an extremely straightforward one-stop, probably in qualifying order, and although, to be fair, it did end up being a one-stop race. Certainly not in the way anyone expected it would pan out.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, despite it being just a one-stop race, I mean, I have to say the Sylvan slopes of the Red Bull Ring certainly delivered their fair share of drama this weekend. I mean, what a race we had. It was already shaping up to be quite the cracker after Mercedes' strategy misstep, and it just kept getting better and better.
Now, we'll get to that in a moment, but to set up the scene for this race, the Red Bull Ring, which is, as you say, it's in the... I won't repeat your words, but it was in amongst the Styrian Mountains, perhaps the most scenic Grand Prix we have. But in terms of a circuit profile, it isn't the shortest, but it is the quickest.
Yeah.
The pole position time for Valtteri Bottas was around 63 seconds. There was a hope that maybe we could get it down to less than a minute, but I think that opportunity's probably passed Formula One by for the medium term. But the circuit itself is not particularly extreme other than scenically. There's no particularly long straight, no particularly fast corners or particularly slow corners. That's not to say it isn't tricky, but as a result we have a circuit that doesn't really degrade or wear the tyres very much, and combined with on Friday we had pretty cool conditions, the overcast conditions, tyre wear was almost non-existent yet again. Yeah,
I mean, if I had to give this circuit human qualities, I would say it's a very Kimi Raikkonen circuit. It is what it is. But yeah, you're right. I mean, tyre wear is non-existent. The surface is smooth for the most part.
Yes.
You've got, well, the corners are again they are what they are kind of corners. But yeah, drama as we discussed.
Yes, and that will unfold. One of the few tyre quirks, if you like, that we found during Friday practice was that the Ultra Soft, which was the softest tyre, we also had the Super Soft, slightly harder, and the Soft, hardest. Still, was graining. That was the only issue any of the tyres seemed to have. So sliding across the circuit wasn't performing at its optimum, but even Mario Isola on Friday evening after free practices 1 and 2 said probably by free practice 3 the teams will engineer that graining out. And there'd be no problems. In fact, the Pirelli forecast for this race, as we said, was an easy one-stop. But I think for the first time all year, almost they were saying, well, you can probably stop whenever you want, and the tyres will last as long as you want them to.
Yeah.
So it wasn't great forecast strategically. But it does sort of go to show, and this was weirdly a discussion topic for the Austrian Grand Prix weekend, maybe because everyone was expecting it to be so boring. But with so many practice sessions, the quirks that you do discover earlier on in the weekend almost never eventuate by the end of the race because the teams are so good at perfecting setup.
Yeah, true. I think as we were discussing in the media center, I think before the start of the race or qualifying or something, I remember you remarking, this is going to be such a boring race, because you saw Pirelli strategy forecast, and then when you went for lunch at Pirelli, you picked up that race set tire sheet, and everyone just had it was clearly going to be a boring race. But it's one thing to say that teams are so good at perfecting setups, but I think some of them were actually caught out by, I think, the higher track temperatures that we saw on Sunday, because I think track temperatures were somewhere around 47, 50 degrees Celsius, which is the highest we've seen all weekend. And Ricciardo obviously most notably caught out by that, and even Hamilton couldn't make, he was struggling with the tires after he pitted. So maybe they over-engineered their cars, I don't know, but yeah, certainly caught out by the higher track temperatures.
And that was the difference, as you say. The temperature forecast was moving up and down quite a bit earlier in the weekend. Originally, Saturday and Sunday were always destined to be quite warm. But then that forecast was downgraded. In fact, the weather wasn't particularly warm, but the sun was out the entire day, from the beginning of the support races right up to the start of the Grand Prix, which meant the track was really warm, was completely different to the track that teams learned and experienced on Friday during practice. And that seems to really be the decisive factor more than any strategic decision, was simply the fact that the weather was very warm. Now, if we go into the start of the Grand Prix, Valtteri Bottas was the pole sitter, lost pole at the first turn to Lewis Hamilton, almost lost second to Kimi Raikkonen in an ambitious move. And this is actually something that I feel like it's almost becoming part of Ferrari's strategy, though. Now, Sebastian Vettel wasn't in contention to take the lead of the race at the first turn because he'd had a 3-place grid penalty, so started from 6th. But back in qualifying 2, when the top 10 drivers decide on their race start tyres, Mercedes and Red Bull Racing, wanting that little bit of extra strategic flexibility, I guess, and trying to avoid maybe the graining on the ultra-soft tyres, chose to qualify on the super softs. But Ferrari didn't. And they did that in France as well. It was the same split between those teams. And the difference is, especially in a race where everyone expected all the tyres to be more or less the same, it gave Ferrari, and in this situation, Kimi Raikkonen, a little bit of extra grip. And I guess that sort of speaks to Ferrari's idea that, especially Mercedes seemed so quick this weekend, that maybe track position is what they needed to try and beat them.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, Ferrari have been very nimble with their thinking, strangely. I mean, uncharacteristically, I would say, in terms of their strategy, in terms of tire. They've almost become like what Red Bull used to do. Go for an alternative strategy. And it almost worked for Kimi, as it almost worked for Seb in France. For a few hundred meters. It seemed that Kimi was in second, and when he got to turn 3, he basically, he got offline, got on the dirty bit of the circuit, and he had a snap of oversteer, and that was it. And that basically, Kimi, I mean, what a funny race he had. He finished second. He was charging at the end, fastest lap record, what have you. But he didn't actually pass anyone, and he in fact got passed a few times, but he still finished second.
Yeah, it was very unusual. On a weekend where there's been a lot of speculation about whether or not he'll be in the car as soon as the Belgian Grand Prix, if not 2019. I get the result he wanted probably, but yeah, as you say, not really the resounding dominant race for the Finn that maybe he would have hoped a second place would entail.
Yeah, absolutely. Because he never really, this is what happens with Kim. He sort of, he makes progress and then he knocks himself back in the space of a few hundred meters.
I guess he just had that ultra soft grip advantage, and by the time obviously everyone else had warmed up their tyres, it had dissipated, and that was that. And it seemed like that was more or less going to be how the race was going to pan out. At that time, we didn't realise how the weather was affecting those tyres, but that all changed on lap 14 when Valtteri Bottas ground to a halt with a hydraulics problem, a rare Mercedes technical failure, if you like. Another dose of bad luck for Valtteri Bottas, I guess, considering it was first pole of the year and felt like this was maybe the last opportunity he would have to try and stake a claim into the championship fight between Vettel and Hamilton that's quickly escaping him. Yeah.
I really thought this weekend was the weekend Bottas's luck would turn. This is a track he goes very well at. He scored his first podium here for Williams. He won here last year. Hamilton was out of position last year, but he won here, and it was a pretty commanding victory. And he sort of went into this weekend with a certain sense of purpose and determination, because after qualifying, he said, I can guarantee you there's nobody more hungry for the win on this grid than I am. He had his sights set on that, and you really thought it would turn for him. But, another one of those what could have been races for Bottas, sadly. Yes, that is the lap that, as you say, the race basically turned on its head, because Mercedes, up to that point, were looking set for a comfortable 1-2. They introduced their engine step at Paul Ricard, last weekend. This weekend, they've brought some significant aerodynamic upgrades to their car, and it all seemed to be working so well for them.
It all seemed familiarly dominant for Mercedes, obviously, until that technical failure. And that gave teams a question, because this was sort of right on the cusp of the first pit stop window that Pirelli recommended, especially if you were starting on the super soft tyres, as some of the cars were. But we did see most teams come into the pits because there was a virtual safety car triggered, which of course meant everyone slowed down. Not as much as a full safety car, obviously, but nonetheless. And when I say most, I mean most except Lewis Hamilton, who was leading the race at the time. And it almost immediately it seemed like it was an error, because Red Bull Racing behind him and Ferrari, they all dived into the pits. In fact, they all double stacked, especially Red Bull Racing. Not the first time they've done that this year, and executed it again. Yes, excellently well. And it wasn't long before Lewis Hamilton sort of noted this as well. And rarely we hear James Vowles, the chief strategist at Mercedes, on the pit radio. This was one of the occasions where suddenly he was all over it, admitting, and again, this is also extremely rare, that he'd made a mistake, A, and had lost him the win, B, which is incredible. When's the last time we ever heard that over team radio?
Yeah. And this is, it was a grave error. It was a glaring strategy error because, but because under virtual safety car conditions, the track isn't at full speed and you can just sort of get effectively a free pit stop. Now, I know being the lead car, you've got to make, that call is probably tougher to make. It's more of a dilemma because that basically allows the others to react to what you're doing. And had Hamilton come in and Red Bull split their strategies, leaving one of their drivers out or whatever, that could have cost him track position. But I still think, yes, it would have cost him track position, but I still think he would have regained the lead when those cars would have pitted later on, because I don't think he would have fallen out of that or been held up in traffic long enough to fall out of their pit window. So definitely a glaring strategy error. James Vowles owned up to it, and it's not their first, and especially not their first with Hamilton.
This is particularly interesting, I think, because we obviously know Mercedes over the last so many years as being this dominant force. However, in the first 3 years in particular, they were never really challenged, were they? There were the odd race they'd lose, but they'd be always some unusual circumstance or an obscure technical failure that caused it. In terms of strategy, it was only ever between Lewis Hamilton and Nico Rosberg, which is not really strategy when you think about it. You usually just pit whoever's in the lead first because that's the way it is, and you go on your way. More recently, however, when they have been tested, we have seen these errors emerge, and it's almost as though those 3 years of not really having to do very much on the strategy front have left them extremely unfit for a match, extremely unmatched fit, if you like.
Yeah,
and
or rusty.
Yeah, rusty. We've seen these errors. China was a particularly good example where Lewis Hamilton should have pit when Daniel Ricciardo, Max Verstappen pitted.
It was the same thing,
exactly the same thing. Australia, likewise,
Yeah.
a not dissimilar error to this one in the sense that they didn't anticipate how advantageous safety cars and virtual safety cars would be on pitting and not pitting. It's unusual, and you consider how many points now, notwithstanding the fact both Mercedes cars ultimately didn't finish the race, so this strategic error never really came on to bear in terms of the points, but there are a lot of points lost through these strategic errors rather than anything else.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, of course, we know both of them retired. We know Hamilton retired this weekend, so that was a big load of points lost on this weekend already. But even if he had finished, he would still have behind Vettel in fourth or whatever, he would still have retained the lead of the championship, but by a smaller margin again. So yes, they have thrown away quite a few points. They lost the win in Australia, well, possibly in China as well. The thing is with Mercedes, this is something interesting, was Toto Wolff was asked on Saturday after qualifying about the errors Sebastian Vettel has been making and how that could be crucial to the championship. Because Vettel's come into this weekend under the spotlight for his error in France, and people are then talking about Baku, Singapore, and Baku last year. And Toto said, if there are points and if you leave some points on the table, they could come back to bite you. And ironically, that's exactly what happened. I mean, but to his team. So they have lost a lot of points this championship, and yeah.
It would have been really interesting. Now, we talk about that dilemma, and this is what Mercedes said, that, as the lead car, yes, you're in your pit stop window, but if you come in, it's very easy for everyone else to just react and not come in. Christian Horner said after the race he was committed to bringing both drivers in. Didn't say whether or not it would be dependent on Lewis Hamilton, but it would have been fascinating had Hamilton pitted if Red Bull Racing would have decided to split the strategies, because in some respects, considering at this point they still really thought it was going to be an easy one-stop, there wouldn't have been really anything to lose either way, because with Bottas out of the race, you're doing that classic pincer movement where you can't defend against two cars as a single driver. So potentially there could have been a really interesting strategic battle going on there. In some senses that did transpire, because with Lewis Hamilton now sort of out for the count, he was told he needed to either find 8 seconds worth of time over the drivers with newer tyres, or they'd lost the race, essentially.
Which is basically they've lost the race.
Exactly. So they brought him in for his first pit stop on lap 25, so about 10 laps later, and he dropped back into the pack with Kimi Räikkönen and Daniel Ricciardo. But this is the point, more or less, where we started realising that these tyres were not going to make a one-stop very straightforward. Now, Max Verstappen seemed fine up ahead now, considering that he had clear air and I guess was running his own race. But Daniel Ricciardo in particular seemed to be struggling with blistering on the rear tyres, which is in some senses the opposite of graining. Graining tends to happen in colder conditions, whereas blistering in warmer temperatures, as we saw on Sunday.
Yeah.
And suddenly this was looking like maybe a two-stop. And before you knew it, now Daniel Ricciardo, he made his own second pit stop. He couldn't make it all the way to the end on lap 38. And that seemed like, well, that's an easy position for Lewis Hamilton. But then around that time, Lewis Hamilton started experiencing graining of his own. This is when he got really unhappy.
Yeah, Lewis was not happy. But yeah, I mean that's right. But the interesting thing is, Max seemed fine. Okay, he was in clear air. He was leading. He was managing his pace, and there was blister developing on his tire, but never got as bad as it did for Ricciardo. The Ferraris were fine. I mean, Kimi was told, I think around lap 55, I think it was, that he can now start pushing. There's nothing to worry and just go for it. You know, so that deep into the stint, he was told he was unleashed, basically. The Ferraris were unleashed. So I don't know why that. I mean, it's just this thing this season that we've seen, that tires behave differently on different cars, and so much so that, you know, even different cars on the same team, because it could be something so minor like a setup difference, or just the way the driver's sort of loading the tire up into the corner, you know, driving style, etc. It could be so minor, but it can have, like we saw yesterday, even cars in the same team. You know, such vast differences in the way they use their tires.
I thought Christian Horner sort of summed this up really well, with Daniel obviously in traffic and regardless perhaps using the tyres differently. But he noted that especially once there was that middle stint of the race where everyone seemed to be cruising, and even into the end of the race, to be fair, he noted that Max Verstappen was taking it very easy around the last two turns, which I think at the moment are 8 and 9 or 9 and 10. Can't remember with the renumbering.
The two quick right-handers.
Yes. Taking it very easy around there, but then hammering it around the rest of the track where the blistering wouldn't be as severe, where it wouldn't promote blistering as much, which is why we sort of saw the gap wax and wane over the course of a lap between him and the pursuing Kimi Räikkönen. There are a couple of interesting questions to come out of that battle as well. One of which, and this is not unlike the battle we saw, where was it, where Valtteri Bottas was being chasing down Sebastian Vettel earlier in the year, is that timing of when you decide to push. And obviously this is a difficult question to answer because teams are managing all sorts of things, from how much they think they have of their tyres left and how much fuel they expect to have remaining by the end of the race. But you can't help but think that given that on the last lap it was just a little bit more than a second difference between Max Verstappen in first and Kimi Räikkönen in second, that a slightly earlier time to push, even if they were to run out of tyres in the last laps and had to conserve, might just push Verstappen's tyres, which were clearly had some damage on them, to breaking point. It might have forced the issue. Yeah,
I think this is a very easy thing to answer in hindsight.
Yes,
obviously you should have pushed earlier. I mean, the same with Bottas and Bahrain, but it's impossible to say because you don't know how long your tires are going to actually. I mean, and simulations, hotter track temperatures, simulations are simulations. You just throw them out of the window. But had Kimi pushed earlier, would his tires have lasted or gotten this? Because see, Max had the lead. Max had a certain gap, so he could nurse his pace and his tires better than Kimi would have been able to, because Kimi would have been just hell for leather pushing. So it could have sort of backfired on Kimi. But what I think Ferrari should... So it's impossible to say, you know, until after the race and you measure the wear and everything on the tires after the race, you know, the timing of when you push. But I think, you know, what Ferrari should have done was got Kimi to push hell for leather, put pressure on Max. Seb could have played the waiting game because they had two cars. Red Bull had just the one. You know, they could have outgunned Max. So that way, even if Kimi cooked his tires and Max cooked his tires, Seb was right there waiting to take the win. And they were so far ahead. There were just three top runners left. Everyone else was a lap down. So there was absolutely nothing to lose by holding Seb back.
Which is also the second question, I think, of this. Ultimately, the end result rather necessarily than whether or not or when drivers should push. But given that, let's not mince words, Kimi Räikkönen's not really in this championship fight. He's been lackluster, let's say, so far this season, other than a couple of good performances early on.
Let's not be too harsh. It is what it is.
It is what it is. But Sebastian Vettel was in third. Lewis Hamilton obviously was not finishing the race. He came into this race, did Sebastian Vettel with a 14-point deficit. He leaves it with a 1-point advantage. That could have been a bigger advantage had Ferrari done what they've done here before, and also done at many other racetracks before, and swapped positions of their drivers so that Vettel finished second. Do you think that perhaps they should have? Is this going to be similar to what we talked about after the Hungarian Grand Prix last year, where Hamilton let Bottas overtake him on the last corner of the last lap? A discussion point whereby we say, well, if Vettel loses the title by 2 or 3 points, we're all going to point to this race where Ferrari easily could have given him those points.
I don't know. I personally think if you look at it from purely sort of logical sense, championship point of view, sort of a sense, then yes, they should have swapped. But I personally am glad that they did not. Just as I was glad that Hamilton handed Bottas that place back in Hungary. That's not fair. It wasn't so much a swapping of positions as Hamilton basically living up to the promise he made to Bottas, saying, "You let me go, and if I can't get past or whatever, I'll hand the place back to you." It was sporting, and yes, as you say, Ferrari have done this in the past in Austria, infamously in 2002, in Austria in 2001 to a lesser degree, and at racetracks around the world. But I think there is a sense of, and I know they did it in Monaco last year and Hungary last year in a way.
Monaco last year. Well, yeah. I mean, they did. They did, but they did it tactfully.
Yes.
Well, tactfully, yeah. Pit stop strategy.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is maybe there's been some sort of and I've noticed there's a different dynamic within the team this year. It's that there isn't as much of a number one, number two dynamic anymore, is what I sense. And I think there's been a cultural shift also brought in by the new management. Now, I know this new management's been in place. They were in place when they did Monaco and Hungary last year, but I just think that might be the case. I mean, I don't know. Especially for a driver who's going to be leaving the team reportedly anyway at the end of this year. Yeah. But I guess they just want to do it right.
And
fair
in
enough.
A
sporting manner, which is good, and good on you, Ferrari, for that.
Yeah, well, there you go, and we'll wait and see if those points do count for anything towards the end of the season, but a slender 1-point advantage for Sebastian Vettel coming out of this race. And that was the order for the top three: Max Verstappen, Kimi Räikkönen, Sebastian Vettel. No other front runners finished. One of the most attrition-based races that I can remember in recent times. Very rare to have all of these failures. Daniel Ricciardo obviously also failed. It was an exhaust problem that started blowing on all parts of the back of the car. Yeah. And I think ultimately affected the gearbox.
It was amazing. It was like Formula 1 15, 20 years ago.
And Lewis Hamilton had a problem of his own as well, obviously, and he retired. So.
Yes. Loss in fuel pressure, I think it was, yeah.
Which I wonder if loss of fuel pressure means no fuel. I can't help but wonder that, but we'll never know, I suppose. Further down the order, though, this is a big result for the team of Haas, 4th and 5th. Romain Grosjean, Kevin Magnussen. Hard to know if this is a bigger result for Haas or for Romain Grosjean. First points of the season, delivering on the promise that they'd made essentially at the start of the season. This is the result they expected to get in Australia, to be honest, till they forgot to put their tyres on at the first pit stop. Interesting to note that Grosjean and Magnussen had split their strategies. One of the two teams, really, that split their strategies in a big way. The other one was Force India, which finished behind them, Ocon and Perez. Grosjean, in this situation, pitted behind the safety car, the virtual safety car, and Kevin Magnussen didn't. He waited till lap 28. And it's interesting that in the case of Ocon and Perez behind them, where Ocon pitted behind the virtual safety car and Perez didn't, that time difference seemed to count just enough. And as a result, the drivers that pitted later, not behind the virtual safety car, finished behind their teammates that did, which does show that, I mean, sometimes the virtual safety car feels like a bit of a grey area, doesn't it? A, you don't know when it's going to end. Yeah. And B, it's not as slow as a safety car, so it doesn't always work the way you expect it to. But I think in this situation, where the lap is quite short and we're overtaking not that easy, it did make a difference for these two teammates.
Yeah, it's not just a short lap; it's also a fast lap. You know, and while the virtual safety car may not slow down the race as much as the actual safety car does, it does slow it down. But it is slower than full race conditions. So, you know, if the virtual safety cars just come out and you're passing the pit entrance, just pit.
Which is normally what drivers are instructed to do.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I understand that bit. There's a grey area where you don't know when it's ending, and that's what got Sebastian Vettel out in Spain last year, if you remember. So yeah, I mean, that's just the way it is, and you just have to capitalize on these opportunities that that pop up occasionally.
And perhaps noteworthy, we talk about Haas, we talk about Force India, which is a pretty big result for them as well, given they've been sort of lukewarm so far this season. One key team missing here was Renault. Now, Nico Hülkenberg had a failure, a power unit failure early in the race as well, just before Valtteri Bottas did, actually. Some said that's maybe what the party mode they've brought into this race is. With
that was quite a party in the back of Hülkenberg's car, I can tell you.
Yeah, it really went off. But Carlos Sainz was missing from this. He didn't have any technical problems, other than he had especially bad blistering. Now he was on a two-stop, started on the ultra soft, pitted behind the virtual safety car on lap 15, then had to pit again on lap 34. So only 20 or 19 laps later, made it to the end with the super softs. He was in the points before that. This should have been a points-paying race for Renault,
absolutely.
Which really shows. I mean, the top teams obviously had somewhat of a handle on it. They could manage it, but in the midfield where it's much tighter, where you're really fighting all the time, and where in some respects I suppose you could say the team maybe not less experienced but less well resourced to handle these problems after practice, it really bit him really hard.
Yeah, it did. I mean, it's going to turn on these small little differences, because the midfield battle is so tight that you get one thing wrong, and it's not really getting it wrong. It's just that his car chewed through its tires to a greater degree than his rivals did. So Sainz was another classic case of what happened to Ricciardo and what happened to Hamilton. They just couldn't make their tires last, and they were struck by blistering. But yeah, it was enough to drop him out of the points.
But it was enough to ensure that Sauber got its first double points finish since 2015, I believe it was. Charles Leclerc, I don't want to say in particular was impressive because he finished ahead of Marcus Ericsson. I think he just simply had the better strategy. He pitted behind the virtual safety car as well. He started quite far back. He had a 5-place gearbox penalty. Whereas Marcus Ericsson did the opposite. And not only did he just pit later, he started on the soft tyre, ran all the way till lap 45 and then switched onto the super soft. It still obviously made him up some positions, but not as... it still comes back to that point that even that time, it was obviously not a full 20 seconds like you might expect behind a safety car or whatever it is, dependent on the circuit. But it didn't make enough of... It made enough of a difference for Leclerc that he could finish ahead of Ericsson and continue this run. I think this is 5 points finishes in 6 races now for him, which is an impressive result and impressive for Sauber.
Yeah, absolutely. And there was a good bit of sportsmanship at Sauber as well, because I mean, as you can see, Leclerc finished ahead of Ericsson, but Ericsson had actually been let through by Leclerc because he thought he could take the fight to the cars ahead, and Ericsson handed the place back to Leclerc as was agreed when he couldn't. So great bit of sportsmanship there that we probably should mention as well.
Yeah, definitely. And it's all sort of happening for Sauber as well when you consider that Williams, on the other hand, did no good again in this race, sunk through the field like a stone. Yeah, exactly right. We won't talk about them. We've talked about them plenty. Pierre Gasly's worth a mention. He finished just outside the points. He had horrific tyre wear, but that was largely because he had a collision with Stoffel Van Dorn on the first lap, and that knocked his rear left suspension out of place, or rear right perhaps, and was all over the place obviously after that car. But Fernando Alonso, I think we should maybe conclude a mention on. This was an impressive drive, because he scored points in 8th place, so he took home the first points from McLaren in a little while now actually, but also because he started from pit lane, given he broke Parc Fermé conditions, because McLaren broke so many front wings on the curbs at this circuit that they had to fly in not a new one but a 2017 spec front wing bolted onto the front of the car. Alonso
really are going backwards, aren't they?
Yeah, exactly. He said afterwards, we had no idea how to set it up, we didn't know what flap angle to use, we didn't know how it was going to respond on the car. At the start of the race, he was doing quite poorly. I think he said something to the effect like, there's no way I'm sitting 71 laps doing this race behind all the midfield. But on the fresher tyre, he pitted behind the VSC. On the soft tyre, it all came alive for him. He did extremely well on it. The car with its old wing loved it somehow. And it does sort of go to show, we come back to that point, that different cars use the same tyres differently. This weird Frankenstein car used them very well.
Well, because it was going so slow. There was no stress on the tyres.
I suppose that's true. It was an interesting Austrian Grand Prix from a strategic point of view, given that I guess conventional wisdom in hindsight would have suggested this should have been a 2-stop race and perhaps the teams would have planned as much, but it was a 1-stop race, just a really weird one where all the drivers thought they were going to retire with tyre failures. Luckily, none of them did. Most of them just had technical failures. Well, we can only hope that races continue to be this interesting with the last of our triple header at the British Grand Prix next weekend. But for now, Abhishek Takle, it's been a pleasure to look back on the Austrian Grand Prix with you.
Likewise, it's been a suitably Sylvan setting to race in, and Great to be on the show.
Just say goodbye.
Goodbye.
That was freelance F1 journalist Abhishek Takle. The Strategy Report is a Beer Mogul podcast, and you can get every episode by subscribing on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you normally get your podcasts. And don't forget to leave a review to help other F1 fans find the show. You can also read the written report at f1strategyreport.com or stay up to date by finding us on Facebook and Twitter. My name's Michael Lamonato. You can find me at Michael Lamonato on Twitter, and I'll catch you next week for a wrap-up of the British Grand Prix.